This land does not belong to the HOA. The judge's voice cut through the courtroom like a clean snap of dry timber, sharp and final, and for a second I just stood there, fingers still stained with the same red Texas dirt they tried to take from me, staring at a room full of people who had spent months telling me I didn't belong on my own property. But to understand how it got to that moment, you have to go back to the day I was handed a trespassing notice while standing on land my father bled to pay off. The paper felt too smooth in my hands, official, expensive, the kind of paper that assumes it's right before you even read it, and the smell of fresh ink mixed with the dry heat rolling off the open field behind me. I remember the crunch of gravel under my boots as I turned and looked past the man who handed it to me, past his clipboard and his rehearsed apology, and saw it. A brand new fence. Clean posts. Straight lines. Wrong lines. It sliced across the land like it had always been there, like it had a right to be there, like my entire life on that property had been erased overnight. "You'll need to vacate immediately," he said, not meeting my eyes, like he already knew this wasn't right, but didn't care enough to stop it. Behind him, a white SUV idled near the gate, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the late afternoon sun straight into my eyes. And leaning against it, arms crossed, was Margaret Whitmore, HOA president, real estate agent, the kind of woman who smiles like she's doing you a favor while she takes something that isn't hers. Her sunglasses hid her eyes, but I could feel her watching me, measuring me, deciding how easily I'd fold. "This property now falls under community jurisdiction," she said, voice smooth, practiced, like she'd said it 100 times before. "It's all been approved." Approved. That word echoed in my head as I looked back at the fence, at the way it cut straight through the old boundary marker my dad had set himself 30 years ago. A marker I could still see in my mind, hammered into the ground with hands that never took shortcuts, never guessed, never got it wrong. And that's when something didn't sit right. Because that line, that wasn't where it was supposed to be. The air felt different all of a sudden, heavy, like right before a storm, and the distant hum of construction equipment carried across the field, low and constant, like they were already building something they thought they owned. I folded the notice once, slow and deliberate, the paper creasing under my thumb, and looked back at Margaret. She gave me that same tight smile, the kind that says the decision's already been made and you just haven't accepted it yet. But here's the thing she didn't know. My father didn't just own that land. He documented every inch of it like his life depended on it. And somewhere in those records was a mistake big enough to bring everything she built crashing down. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just turned, boots grinding into the gravel, and walked back toward my truck, the notice still in my hand, already knowing this wasn't over. Not even close. I have always measured land the way my father taught me, not just in acres or feet, but in memory, in effort, in the quiet weight of everything that came before me. And standing there that afternoon with a trespassing notice in my hand, I could feel all of that pressing down on my chest like the air had gotten heavier without warning. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I am 36 years old, and I have spent most of my life working as a civil engineer, the kind who studies lines on paper and turns them into something real: roads, drainage systems, boundaries that people trust because they are supposed to be exact. That is the thing about land. It does not lie, not if it is measured right. My father understood that better than anyone. He bought that property just outside Austin in the early 1990s, back when it was nothing but open field, stubborn soil, and a narrow creek that only ran strong after heavy rain. I still remember the sound of his boots on that same gravel drive, steady and deliberate. The way he would stop at the old boundary marker near the east fence line and tap it with his boot, like he was checking on an old friend. He installed those markers himself, steel rods driven deep into the ground with survey caps stamped with our name, Caldwell, not because he did not trust anyone else, but because he believed if something mattered, you verified it with your own hands. I grew up walking those lines with him, learning how to read a survey map before I was old enough to drive, tracing property boundaries with my finger while he explained easements, setbacks, and why one misplaced line could cost someone everything. He used to say that land disputes are never about dirt. They are about people forgetting what the truth looks like. When he passed, that land was the only thing he left me, free and clear, every payment made, every document filed, every inch accounted for, and I held on to it not because it was valuable, although it was, but because it was the last thing that still felt like him. The smell of dry grass in the summer, the way the wind moved across the field in long waves, even the rusted hinge on the old gate that always squealed just a little too loud. It was all still there, unchanged, until it was not. I did not move onto the property full-time right away. My work kept me busy, projects scattered across counties, long hours reviewing plans and checking compliance reports, but I came back as often as I could, usually early mornings when the air was cool and the light stretched low across the ground, making every marker and every line stand out sharper. That is why what I saw that day felt so wrong. Not just because there was a fence where there should not have been one, but because it ignored everything I knew to be true about that land. The line was off, subtly, almost invisibly to anyone who did not know what they were looking at, but I knew. I could feel it the same way you feel when a level is just slightly off-center, not enough for most people to notice, but enough that you cannot ignore it once you see it. And Margaret Whitmore had built her entire claim on that line. That was what kept running through my head as I drove back home. The low hum of the engine steady beneath me, the folded notice sitting on the passenger seat like it belonged there, like it had always been part of my life. They were confident. That much was obvious. You do not fence off land, post signs, and send legal notices unless you believe you are untouchable, unless you believe no one is going to challenge you. And for a moment, I understood why most people would not. The paperwork looked official. The tone was final. The system, at least on the surface, was already leaning in their favor. But they made one assumption that was going to cost them everything. They assumed I would trust their version of the map more than my own. Margaret Whitmore did not rush things, and that was the first sign she knew exactly what she was doing. Because people who act too fast usually leave gaps. But Margaret built her control slowly, layer by layer, until by the time anyone noticed, it already felt permanent. The first time I ever heard her name was about a year before all this started, during a county permitting meeting where I was reviewing drainage plans for a nearby subdivision, and even then, she stood out without trying. White blazer, perfectly pressed, not a crease out of place, a tablet in one hand and a folder in the other, moving through the room like she owned more than just her seat at the table. She spoke calmly, never raised her voice, but every sentence carried that quiet assumption that things would go her way. People listened. Not because they had to, but because she made it seem like agreeing with her was the easiest option. At the time, I did not think much of it. Every town has someone like that, someone who understands the system well enough to bend it without ever looking like they are breaking it. What I did not realize was how far her influence actually reached. By the time I saw her leaning against that white SUV on my property, she was not just another resident. She was the president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, a position she had held for 3 consecutive terms, each one uncontested. That alone told me everything I needed to know. People do not step aside like that unless they are either satisfied or intimidated, and in neighborhoods like that, it is usually a mix of both. Her background in real estate only made it worse. She understood land value, zoning, and paperwork better than most attorneys, and she used that knowledge like a tool, precise and controlled. Over the next few days, I started hearing more stories, small things at first, conversations that sounded like complaints but were always delivered in a careful tone, like people were measuring their words even when she was not around. A neighbor mentioned how their fence line had to be adjusted after a new survey commissioned by the HOA. Another talked about a shared access road that somehow became community property after a revision in the development plan. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make headlines, but enough to paint a pattern. Margaret did not take things outright. She redefined them until they belonged to her. The more I dug, the clearer it became that my land was not an isolated situation. It was just the largest piece she had tried to move so far. And she did not do it alone. Her husband, Daniel Whitmore, sat on the County Zoning Advisory Board, a position that did not carry direct authority but had enough influence to guide decisions before they were ever finalized. That connection explained how quickly the paperwork had moved, how something as significant as a boundary adjustment could pass through channels without raising alarms. It also explained the confidence I saw in her posture that day, the way she did not need to argue or threaten, because from her perspective, the outcome had already been decided long before I ever showed up. The smell of freshly cut wood from the new fence still lingered in the air when I went back 2 days later, stronger now under the midday sun. and I watched as a crew installed a polished sign right near the entrance. Willow Creek Estates Expansion Phase 2. Clean lettering. Permanent intent. They were not just claiming the land. They were integrating it, making it part of something larger so that undoing it would be more complicated, more expensive, more inconvenient. That was her strategy, not force. Friction. Make it easier for everyone else to accept the change than to challenge it. I stood there long enough to watch two families slow down as they drove past, glancing at the new sign, then at the fence, and then back to the road, already adjusting their understanding of where things belonged. That is how control works. Not in one big moment, but in small shifts that become normal, before anyone questions them. But as I walked the perimeter again, boots pressing into dry soil that had not changed no matter what sign they put up, I kept coming back to that same detail. That line was wrong. And if the line was wrong, then everything built on it, every document, every claim, every decision Margaret Whitmore was so confident in, was built on something that could not hold. The next morning started with the low rumble of diesel engines rolling across my land before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, a deep mechanical growl that did not belong there, steady and confident like it had permission. And when I stepped out of my truck, the smell of exhaust mixed with fresh turned soil hit me immediately, sharp and out of place against the dry, familiar scent of grass I had known my entire life. Two bulldozers were already positioned near the new fence line, their blades angled into the ground, carving out long strips of earth in straight, deliberate passes that followed that same wrong boundary like it was law. Every push of metal against dirt sent a vibration through the ground that I could feel through the soles of my boots, a dull, constant pressure that made it impossible to ignore what was happening. They were not preparing. They were committing. I walked straight toward the nearest operator, raising a hand to get his attention, and when the machine powered down, the sudden silence felt almost unnatural, like the land itself was holding its breath. "You need to stop," I said, keeping my voice even, controlled, the way you do when you know you are right, but also know it does not matter to the person in front of you. He wiped his hands on a rag, glanced past me toward the fence, then back at the paperwork clipped to the side of the machine. "We got clearance," he said, not defensive, just stating a fact he believed. "Everything's signed off." That word again. Signed. Approved. Authorized. It carried weight in every system I had ever worked in, but only when it was backed by something real. I reached into my truck and pulled out a copy of my deed, the edges worn from years of being handled, unfolded it, and held it up between us. "This land is not part of any HOA, I said. "It never has been." He did not even look at it for more than a second. "That is not what we were told," he replied, and that was the moment it clicked. This was bigger than one decision. This was a chain. Someone higher up had already convinced everyone below them that this was legitimate, and now the entire process was moving forward on that assumption. I turned, already knowing who I would find, and sure enough, Margaret was there again, this time standing closer, heels planted firmly in the dirt like she belonged there. The sunlight caught the edge of her sunglasses, throwing a brief glare that forced me to narrow my eyes as I approached. "You are making a mistake," I said, holding the deed out toward her. "Your boundary line is wrong." She did not take the paper. She did not even glance at it. Instead, she smiled, small and controlled, the kind of expression that never quite reaches the eyes. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, my name sounding rehearsed in her voice, "we have already verified all property lines through a licensed survey and county records. If you have concerns, you are welcome to address them through the proper channels." Proper channels. Translation, paperwork, delays, and time, all while they continued building. I felt the heat rising off the ground, mixing with the frustration tightening in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. "You are building on land you do not own," I said. "And when this gets corrected, everything you put here becomes a liability." For the first time, there was a slight pause, barely noticeable, just enough to register, before she adjusted her stance. "Then I suppose we will deal with that if it happens," she replied, as if the outcome was a distant hypothetical instead of an inevitability. Behind her, the engines roared back to life, louder now, more aggressive, the machines resuming their work like the conversation had never happened. Dirt rolled forward in thick waves, reshaping ground that had been untouched for decades, and I stood there for a few seconds longer, watching the line they were cutting, committing it to memory, every angle, every shift, every deviation from where it should have been. Because if they were going to build their claim into the ground itself, then I was going to need to prove, with absolute precision, exactly where they went wrong. And I already knew this was not going to be settled out here in the dirt. This was going to end somewhere else entirely. I thought I could stop it with facts, with documentation, with the kind of logic that had carried me through every project I had ever worked on. Because in my world, if the numbers line up and the measurements are right, the outcome is not a debate. It is a conclusion. But standing in that county office 2 days later, I realized very quickly that this was not that kind of system. The air inside the building smelled faintly of old paper and air conditioning, that recycled, dry scent that never quite leaves government offices, and the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead filled the silence between conversations at the front desk. I laid my documents out carefully: deed, original survey, copies of tax records going back decades. Every piece aligned the way my father taught me, precise and undeniable, and slid them across the counter toward the clerk. She glanced down, flipping through them with practiced efficiency, her expression neutral, detached, like she had seen this kind of dispute more times than she cared to count. There has been a boundary adjustment filed under the Willow Creek Estates expansion, she said after a moment, her tone steady, almost rehearsed. It was reviewed and accepted through the zoning advisory process. There it was again. Accepted. Reviewed. Words that sounded official enough to override everything I was holding in my hands. That adjustment is incorrect, I replied, keeping my voice level, even as I felt that same pressure building behind my ribs. It conflicts with the original survey and deed. The line has been moved. She paused, then reached for another file, thicker, newer, and placed it on the counter between us. Inside were clean, freshly printed maps, sharp lines, updated boundaries, all stamped and signed with the kind of authority that carries weight in rooms like this. I recognized the formatting immediately. License survey. County approved. It looked legitimate because it was designed to look legitimate. If you wish to challenge the adjustment, you will need to file a formal dispute, she continued, sliding a form toward me. There will be a review period. How long? I asked. She hesitated just long enough for me to know I was not going to like the answer. Up to 90 days. 90 days. I could already hear the bulldozers in my head. See the way that fence cut deeper into the land with every passing hour. They were not waiting 90 days. They were building now. I took the form, the paper stiff between my fingers, and stepped aside, letting the next person in line move forward as if nothing had just shifted under my feet. Outside, the heat hit me immediately, heavy and unrelenting, the kind that settles into your clothes and stays there. And I stood on the steps for a moment, staring out at the parking lot, trying to map out the next move. I called the sheriff's office next, thinking maybe enforcement would see what the paperwork was ignoring, but when the deputy arrived later that afternoon, his response was the same, calm, measured, and completely unhelpful. As far as we can tell, the HOA has documentation supporting their claim, he said, resting his hands lightly on his belt as he looked past me toward the construction site. This is a civil matter. Civil matter, meaning they would not stop it, meaning the system was already leaning in one direction, and it was not mine. I stood there as he left, the sound of his patrol car fading down the road, replaced almost immediately by the distant grind of machinery continuing its work. That was the moment it settled in. Not anger, not panic, but clarity. I was not going to win this by reacting to what they were doing. I was not going to outpace a process that was designed to slow me down while they moved forward. If I followed their timeline, I would lose before I even got the chance to prove anything. I looked back at the land, at that same wrong line cutting through it, and for the first time since this started, I stopped trying to stop them. Because if they were willing to build everything on a mistake, then the more they built, the more they had to lose when it finally came apart. And I was starting to understand exactly where that break was going to happen. By the end of that week, the land did not even look like mine anymore. And that was exactly what Margaret Whitmore was counting on, because the fastest way to rewrite ownership is not through paperwork alone. It is through visibility, through making something look so established that people stop questioning how it got there in the first place. The fence line had been reinforced, posts set deeper, cross beams added, and a second crew had started laying out gravel paths that cut across the field in clean, deliberate curves, the kind you see in planned communities where everything is designed to feel intentional. The sound of compactors thudding against the ground carried across the property in steady rhythms, each impact pressing their version of reality deeper into the soil. I kept my distance that morning, parked along the edge of the old access road, watching from behind the line of mesquite trees where my father used to sit during the hottest parts of the day, the shade still thin but familiar. The air smelled different now, less like dry grass and more like dust and crushed stone, and every so often a gust of wind would carry that scent toward me, mixing the past with what they were turning it into. A temporary sign had been replaced with a permanent one, mounted on stone pillars near the entrance, polished and heavy, the kind of structure that tells you someone has already invested too much to turn back. Willow Creek Estates Phase 2, now with directional arrows pointing deeper into what used to be open land. And people were starting to believe it. I watched a couple slow their car as they passed, the driver leaning slightly forward to read the sign, then nodding like it made sense, like it had always been part of the neighborhood. That was the shift Margaret needed, not legal certainty, but social acceptance. Once enough people saw it that way, reversing it would feel disruptive, inconvenient, something to avoid. But I was not watching as a bystander. I was measuring. Every path they laid, every post they set, every corner they squared off. I tracked it against what I knew to be true, mentally overlaying their construction onto the original survey lines burned into my memory. And the more they built, the clearer the pattern became. The deviation was consistent, not random, not a simple error in one spot, but a deliberate shift that ran the entire length of the property line, subtle enough to pass initial review, but significant enough to capture a portion of my land that connected directly to their expansion. That was not a mistake. That was a design. Later that afternoon, I walked the perimeter again, this time on the outside of their fence, boots brushing against the dry weeds that had not yet been cleared, and I found what I had been looking for. It was not obvious unless you knew where to look, half buried and slightly bent, but it was still there. The original survey marker my father had installed decades ago, the stamped cap worn but readable, Caldwell, positioned several feet away from where their new fence line now stood. I crouched down, brushing dirt away with my hand, feeling the cool metal beneath the surface, solid and unmoved despite everything happening around it. That marker did not care about new maps or approved adjustments. It marked where the land actually was. And for the first time since this started, I felt something shift back in my favor, not in the system, not yet, but in certainty. Because now I was not just relying on memory or instinct. I had a physical point, something anchored in the ground that contradicted everything they were building. I stood up slowly, looking back toward the construction, the machines still moving, the workers following lines they believed were correct, and I realized something else at the same time. The more they expanded, the more permanent this would look, and the more damage it would cause when it was undone. And Margaret, standing somewhere behind all of this with that same calm confidence, still believed she had already won. She believed the system would hold, that the paperwork would outweigh anything else. But she had built her entire claim on a line that did not match reality, and I was about to make sure that difference became impossible to ignore. That marker changed everything, not because it proved I was right, but because it showed me exactly where they were wrong, and in my line of work, that difference is where cases are won. I did not go back to the county office that day, and I did not call Margaret, because I already knew how that conversation would go. Instead, I drove straight home, the late afternoon sun cutting low across the road, and spread every document I had across my kitchen table, the same way my father used to do, edges aligned, corners squared, nothing overlapping unless it needed to. The smell of old paper and ink filled the room as I opened the original survey packet, the one stamped nearly 3 decades ago, complete with field notes, bearing measurements, and reference points tied to fixed landmarks that do not move, not fences, not trees, but coordinates anchored to the earth itself. I ran my finger along the line slowly, tracing each segment, matching angles in my head, converting degrees and distances into something I could visualize on the ground. And then I pulled up the newer survey Margaret's HOA had filed. It looked clean, professional, every line sharp, every label in place, every stamp exactly where it should be. That is what made it dangerous, because on the surface, it was convincing. But the deeper I compared the two, the more the gap widened. They had not just shifted the boundary. They had re-referenced it. Instead of tying their measurements to the original fixed points, they used a secondary reference, one that sat just far enough inside my property line to justify their expansion without triggering immediate conflict with neighboring parcels. It was subtle, almost elegant in a way that made me pause, not out of respect, but recognition. This was not sloppy work. This was intentional, and that meant someone knew exactly what they were doing. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking under my weight, and stared at both maps side by side, the difference between them now impossible to ignore. It was only a matter of feet in some places, maybe 12, maybe 15 at the widest stretch, but over the length of the property, it added up to a section large enough to reroute access, lay infrastructure, and claim integration into their development. That was the play. Not a massive land grab that would draw attention, but a controlled shift that most people would never question. But I was not most people. I pulled out my laptop and started overlaying the data digitally, importing coordinates, aligning baselines, adjusting for scale until both surveys sat on top of each other. And when the final alignment locked into place, the error stood out like a fracture line across glass. Clean, continuous, undeniable. I zoomed in on the exact spot where I had found my father's marker, confirming its coordinates against the original survey, and then compared it to the new one. The difference was not just visual now. It was measurable, documented, and repeatable. That was when it stopped being a suspicion and became evidence. But evidence alone does not win anything if it is introduced too early. That was the lesson I had just learned the hard way. The system had already shown me it would not stop them based on what I had. Not yet. So I did something that felt completely wrong at first. I closed the laptop. I stacked the papers back into order. And I decided to wait. Not passively, not blindly, but strategically. Because every hour they continued building on that shifted line, every dollar they invested into making it permanent, increased the weight of what would happen when it was proven invalid. I was not going to chase them anymore. I was going to let them run. And when the time came, I was going to show exactly how far off course they had gone. Waiting did not mean doing nothing. And over the next 2 weeks, I turned my attention into something far more dangerous than confrontation. I turned it into documentation, because if there is one thing the system respects more than confidence, it is consistency backed by evidence that cannot be ignored. Every morning before the crews arrived, I was already there, boots cutting through the thin layer of dust that settled overnight, the air still cool enough to carry sound clearly across the open space, and I recorded everything. The hum of engines starting up, the placement of each new post, the extension of gravel paths measured against fixed points that had not moved in decades. I brought measuring equipment with me, not flashy, not intrusive, just enough to quietly confirm distances, angles, and alignment, writing everything down in a small field notebook the same way my father used to. Simple entries, time, location, deviation. By midday, the heat would rise off the ground in visible waves, distorting the edges of everything. But by then I already had what I needed for that day. And every evening, I transferred it all into a structured log, photographs time-stamped, coordinates matched, overlays updated with each new change they made. The more they built, the stronger my case became, and the difference between their version of the land and reality grew wider with every passing day. I also started paying attention to their process, not just what they were building, but how they justified it. Permits posted near the entrance, laminated sheets listing approvals, contractor licenses, inspection schedules, all displayed like proof of legitimacy. I took copies of everything I could access, photographed documents from a distance when necessary, and cross-checked them later against public records. That was when the second crack appeared. The permits referenced the adjusted boundary, not the original one, meaning every approval they received was based on the same flawed survey. It was not just a single mistake anymore. It was a chain reaction. Every department that signed off on their work had done so using incorrect data, and none of them had verified the underlying reference. They trusted the survey because it looked official, just like the clerk, just like the deputy. And Margaret knew that. She did not need to convince everyone individually. She only needed to establish one version of the truth and let the system repeat it. One afternoon, as I stood near the edge of the property line, a man in a county inspection vest walked past me toward the construction area, clipboard in hand, barely giving me a glance. I watched as he checked off items, spoke briefly with one of the foremen, then signed his name at the bottom of a form without ever stepping beyond the fence line to verify where that line actually sat. That was the moment it became clear how deep this went. Not corruption, not conspiracy, just assumption. A system built to move efficiently, relying on prior approvals instead of rechecking foundations. And Margaret had placed her entire operation on that exact weakness. I leaned against my truck later that day, the metal warm under my hand, looking out over what used to be untouched land, now carved into sections, pathways, and plots that did not belong to them. And for the first time since this started, I could see the full shape of what was happening. They were not just building a neighborhood. They were building evidence against themselves. Every invoice, every inspection, every permit tied their work to a boundary that could be proven wrong. And once that boundary collapsed, everything attached to it would follow. I closed my notebook, the pages filled now with measurements and notes that aligned perfectly with the original survey, and slid it back into my truck. I was no longer trying to stop them. I was letting them document their own mistake, piece by piece, until there was no version of events left where they could claim they did not know. The first person I reached out to was not a lawyer, and that was intentional, because lawyers work with what you give them, but I needed someone who could see what I was seeing before I handed it off to the system. Someone who understood land the same way I did, not as lines on paper, but as something that had to match reality down to the inch. His name was Robert Hayes, retired surveyor, late 60s, the kind of man who still wore the same worn leather boots he probably had for 20 years, soles scuffed, laces replaced more than once, and a truck that rattled just enough to let you know it had earned every mile. My father used to mention him occasionally, always with a quiet respect, the kind that does not need to be explained. I had not spoken to him in years, but when I called, he recognized my last name immediately, and there was a pause on the line that told me he already understood why I was reaching out. We met early the next morning out on the property, the sun just starting to push light across the horizon, long shadows stretching over the disturbed ground where the construction had already begun to reshape everything. Robert did not say much at first. He just walked the line slowly, eyes moving from the fence to the ground, then to the horizon, taking it all in with a level of focus that felt almost surgical. The air was still cool, carrying the faint metallic scent of equipment left idle overnight, and the only sound was the soft crunch of dirt under our boots as we moved. When we reached the original marker, the one I had uncovered, he crouched down without a word, brushing away the remaining dust with the back of his hand, revealing the stamped cap beneath. He ran his thumb over the lettering, Caldwell, then nodded once, slow and certain. "That has not moved," he said, voice low, steady. It was not a guess. It was a statement. I handed him copies of both surveys, and he stood there for a moment, holding them side by side, eyes scanning back and forth between the lines and the land in front of him. The silence stretched just long enough to build tension before he exhaled through his nose, a quiet sound that carried more meaning than any explanation. "They did not follow the original reference," he said finally, tapping a point on the newer survey with one finger. "They shifted the baseline. Everything after that is off." Hearing it from him did something different than proving it myself. It removed any remaining doubt, any small voice that might have questioned whether I was seeing what I wanted to see. This was real, measurable, and defensible. We spent the next few hours walking the entire perimeter, verifying each segment, confirming distances with his equipment, logging precise deviations at key points where the difference between the original and the new survey was most significant. The numbers lined up exactly the way I had calculated, consistent error across the full length of the property, not random, not accidental, intentional. By the time the construction crews started arriving, engines rumbling back to life behind us, we had everything we needed from the ground itself. Robert stood up, brushing dirt from his hands, and looked back toward the fence line, then toward the newly placed sign in the distance. "They have already gone too far," he said, not as a warning, but as a conclusion. I knew what he meant. There was a point where something becomes harder to undo simply because of how much has been built on top of it, and Margaret had crossed that point without realizing it. I gathered the notes, the measurements, the confirmations, and for the first time since this started, I was not just building a case. I was building something that could not be dismissed, something that would force the system to look past its own assumptions. And as I drove away that morning, the sound of construction fading behind me, I knew the next step was not about proving the line was wrong. It was about choosing the exact moment to show it. I did not file anything right away, and that was the hardest part, because every instinct I had told me to move, to act, to push back before they went any further, but instinct is not strategy, and by this point, I understood that timing mattered more than speed. So instead, I started building the case the way it needed to be built, not just with proof, but with structure, something that would hold up the moment it was placed under scrutiny. I reached out to a land use attorney named Daniel Reeves, someone I had worked with indirectly on a prior infrastructure project, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke and only asked questions when they mattered. His office sat on the third floor of a downtown building, the kind with large windows that overlooked the city, and when I walked in, the quiet was immediate. Thick carpet underfoot, the faint scent of coffee and polished wood hanging in the air. I laid everything out in front of him. The original survey, the adjusted one, the field notes, the photographs, the measurements Robert and I had confirmed, every piece aligned in sequence, so there was no confusion about what came first and what followed. He did not interrupt as he reviewed it, just moved slowly through each document, occasionally pausing to compare 2 pages side by side, his expression never giving away more than a slight tightening around the eyes when something stood out. When he finally leaned back, he did not start with an opinion. He started with a question. "How far have they gone?" he asked. I thought about that for a second, not in terms of distance, but in terms of commitment. "They have installed fencing, laid gravel access, placed permanent signage, and begun preparing plots," I said. "They are operating as if ownership is already settled." He nodded once, slow, deliberate, then looked back down at the documents. "Good," he said, and the word caught me off guard just enough to register. "Good," I repeated. He folded his hands on the desk, fingers interlaced, and finally looked directly at me. "The more they invest in a position that is legally flawed, the greater the exposure when it is challenged," he explained. "Right now, they are building liability. You are not just correcting a boundary. You are establishing damages tied to every action taken on that incorrect assumption." That was the shift. Up until then, I had been focused on proving they were wrong. Daniel was focused on what that meant once it was proven. He went through the documents again, this time more quickly, confirming what he had already seen. "The original survey is tied to fixed reference points," he said, tapping the older map. "The newer one redefines the baseline without properly reconciling those references. That is not a minor discrepancy. That undermines the entire adjustment." He paused, then added, "And every permit, every inspection, every contract tied to that adjustment becomes questionable as a result." I could feel the pieces locking into place now, not just technically, but legally, the structure forming around the evidence I had been gathering. "So what do we do?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he stood, walked over to the window, and looked out across the city for a moment, as if measuring something I could not see. "We file," he said finally, turning back toward me. "But not just to dispute the boundary. We file to stop further development, to invalidate the adjustment, and to attach their actions to that invalid claim." He walked back to the desk, placing a hand on the stack of documents. "Timing is critical," he continued. "We want enough activity on their side to establish impact, but not so much that it becomes entangled with third-party ownership that complicates recovery." I thought about the sign, the paths, the ongoing work, and nodded. "They are close," I said. He gave a small, knowing smile. "So are we," he replied. We spent the next hour outlining the approach, not rushed, not reactive, but precise, each step placed where it needed to be, each document assigned its role in the larger argument. And when I finally walked out of that office, the city noise rising up around me, I was no longer reacting to what Margaret Whitmore had done. I was preparing to show exactly what it was going to cost her. The day we filed, the air inside the courthouse felt colder than it should have. That artificial chill that settles into your skin and makes everything feel sharper, more defined. And as I stood there with Daniel Reeves beside me, watching the clerk stamp our documents with a firm, final motion, I could hear the faint echo of that same gavel from the opening moment of all this, like the outcome had already been decided somewhere ahead of us. The filing itself was quiet, almost uneventful, just paper moving across a counter, signatures placed exactly where they needed to be, but the weight behind it was anything but small. We were not just disputing a line on a map. We were challenging everything built on top of it. By the time we stepped back outside, the midday sun hit hard, bright enough to make you squint, and I could feel the shift immediately. This was no longer contained. This was moving into a space where it could not be ignored. It did not take long for the response to come. 2 days later, I was back on the property when a black sedan pulled up near the newly installed entrance sign, the engine idling low, controlled, and Margaret Whitmore stepped out, her posture as composed as ever, sunglasses in place, not a single movement wasted. She walked toward me with the same measured pace I had seen from the beginning, heels steady against the compacted gravel, each step deliberate. "You filed?" she said, not asking, just confirming, her voice calm but tighter than before, like something underneath it had shifted just slightly. "I did," I replied, keeping my tone level, matching hers. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the distant sound of construction continuing behind her, machines still moving as if nothing had changed, because in their world, nothing had yet. She took a slow breath, then reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, extending it toward me without stepping any closer. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," she said. "We can resolve this privately." I did not take the folder. I did not even look at it. "You already chose not to," I answered. That was when the smile faded, just slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough that I could see it, the first real crack in the certainty she had been carrying since the beginning. "You are risking a lot over a technical discrepancy," she said, her voice still controlled, but now with an edge that had not been there before. Technical discrepancy. The words hung in the air between us, and I almost appreciated the precision of them. Because she knew. She knew exactly what that discrepancy meant. "It is not a discrepancy," I said. "It is the foundation of everything you have built out here." The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent of dust and fresh gravel between us, and for a second, the only sound was the low hum of machinery in the distance. She glanced past me toward the property, then back again, recalculating, reassessing. "You should reconsider," she said finally. "Once this moves forward, it will not be as simple to control the outcome." I held her gaze, steady, not reacting, not pushing, just letting the moment sit exactly where it was. "That is the point," I replied. Something in her expression changed then, subtle but undeniable, the confidence still there, but now mixed with something else, something that had not been part of this equation before. Uncertainty. She lowered the folder slightly, her grip tightening just enough to show it, then gave a small nod, like she had reached a decision. "We will see," she said, turning back toward her car without another word. The engine started again, smooth and quiet, and as she drove away, the construction behind me continued, unchanged on the surface, but now tied to something much larger than she could control. I stood there for a moment longer, looking out over the land, the fence, the paths, the sign, everything she had built on that shifted line, and for the first time, I could see the full arc of what was coming. Not loud, not sudden, but inevitable. The courtroom was quieter than I expected, not silent, but controlled, like every sound had been measured before it was allowed to exist. The faint shuffle of papers, the low murmur of voices, the steady hum of air conditioning overhead, all of it contained within walls that had seen arguments like this before and would see them again long after we were gone. I sat at the table beside Daniel Reeves, hands resting flat against the polished surface, feeling the smooth grain of the wood under my fingertips as I looked across the room at Margaret Whitmore. She looked exactly the same as she had on my land, composed, precise, dressed in the same kind of calculated professionalism that suggested control, but there was something different now, something just beneath the surface that had not been there before, a tightness around her posture, a stillness that felt less like confidence and more like focus. The judge entered, the room rising and settling again in one fluid motion, and then it began. Daniel did not rush. He never did. He started with the foundation, not the argument, not the accusation, but the facts, laying out the original survey, the fixed reference points, the history of the property, each piece placed carefully into the record with the kind of clarity that does not need emphasis to carry weight. I listened as he walked through it, The same information I had studied for weeks now presented in a way that made it impossible to ignore, each detail building on the last, forming a structure that felt solid even before it was tested. Margaret's attorney responded with equal precision, presenting the adjusted survey, the approvals, the permits, everything that had allowed their expansion to move forward. And for a moment, it almost looked balanced, two versions of the same reality laid out side by side. But then Daniel shifted. He introduced the overlay. The digital alignment of both surveys, the one I had built at my kitchen table, now projected clearly, every line visible, every deviation impossible to hide. The room changed in that moment, not dramatically, not with raised voices or sudden reactions, but with a subtle shift in attention, the kind that happens when something becomes undeniable. He pointed to the baseline reference, explained how it had been altered, how that single change carried through every subsequent measurement, moving the entire boundary in a way that looked legitimate on paper but did not match the physical markers on the ground. He brought in the field notes, the photographs, the verified coordinates Robert and I had documented, tying each piece back to the original survey until there was no gap left for interpretation. Margaret's attorney tried to respond, questioning methodology, suggesting interpretation, but it was different now. The argument no longer held the same weight because it was no longer supported by a consistent foundation. The judge leaned forward slightly, looking at the overlay, then at the documents, then back again, and I could see the moment the connection was made. It was not dramatic. It was quiet, but it was decisive. When Daniel finished, he did not add anything extra. He did not push. He simply stepped back and let the evidence stand on its own. The room settled again into that same controlled silence, but it felt different now, heavier, like the outcome was no longer uncertain, just waiting to be spoken. I glanced across the room one more time, and Margaret met my eyes briefly, her expression still composed, but the certainty that had defined her from the beginning was no longer there in the same way. It had been replaced by something else, something that comes when the structure you built no longer holds under pressure. And as the judge began to speak, that same sharp clarity from the very beginning returned, not as a memory this time, but as something real, unfolding exactly where it was always going to end. This land does not belong to the HOA. The judge's voice did not rise. It did not need to, because the clarity in it carried more weight than anything louder ever could. And as those words settled into the room, everything Margaret Whitmore had built, every assumption, every document, every carefully positioned line, lost its foundation all at once. There was no dramatic reaction, no sudden movement, just a shift, subtle but absolute, like something heavy finally giving way after being under pressure for too long. The judge continued, outlining the decision in precise terms, invalidating the adjusted survey, confirming the original boundary as the controlling reference, and tying that determination directly to every action taken based on the incorrect line. Permits issued under the revised boundary were now subject to review. Construction within the disputed area was unauthorized. Liability was no longer theoretical. It was established. I sat there, hands still resting on the table, feeling the weight of it not as relief, but as confirmation, the kind that settles deep because it matches what you have known from the beginning. Across the room, Margaret remained composed, but the stillness around her had changed. It was no longer controlled confidence. It was containment, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to adjust. When the hearing ended and people began to move, chairs shifting, papers being gathered, the quiet order of the room returning to motion, I stood and stepped out into the hallway, the air warmer there, carrying the distant sounds of the building in a way that felt almost unfamiliar after the controlled silence inside. Daniel joined me a moment later, offering a small nod, not celebratory, just acknowledging what had been done. Now it moves to enforcement, he said, calm as ever, and I nodded, already understanding what that meant. The ruling was not the end. It was the point where everything they had built would have to face what it was built on. A few days later, I was back on the property, standing near the same entrance where that polished sign still stood, but the atmosphere had changed. The machines were silent now, parked in place, their presence no longer active but waiting, like they had been paused mid-sentence. The gravel paths remained, the fence still ran along that same incorrect line, but it no longer carried the same authority. It looked different, not because it had physically changed, but because the meaning behind it had been stripped away. A county vehicle was parked near the entrance, an inspector stepping out, clipboard in hand, this time walking past the fence, past the surface, toward the markers that had always been there. I watched as he crouched near the original survey point, brushing away the dirt just like I had, just like Robert had, confirming what had never moved. The process was beginning to reverse, not quickly, not dramatically, but inevitably. I walked along the edge of the property one more time, boots pressing into the ground that still felt the same beneath me, the same solid resistance that had been there since before any of this started, and I stopped at the marker, looking down at the stamped cap, Caldwell, still anchored exactly where it was supposed to be. The wind moved lightly across the field, carrying the faint scent of dust and distant gravel, and for a moment, everything was quiet again, not empty, but settled. They had said it was theirs. They built on that belief, reinforced it, tried to make it permanent. But the land never agreed. And in the end, it did not need to speak loudly to be heard. It just needed to stay exactly where it had always been.